Hello, good morning, good evening to depending on where you are. My name is Dhruva Jayashankar, and I'm Executive Director of ORF America. We're very pleased to be co-organizing this virtual briefing on the Quad with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Washington, D.C., and the Japan Center for International Exchange, USA. As Indian, Australian, and Japanese affiliated organizations based here in the United States, part of our purpose is to bring perspectives from our countries on contemporary strategic affairs to audience in the United States and around the world. I would like to remind all listeners that this session is on the record and is being recorded. And after hearing from our three speakers today, participants will have a chance to ask questions. Please type your questions into the chat box, and I will try to direct them to our speakers over the next hour. We are here to discuss the Quad, a grouping of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, whose leaders were meant to convene next week in Australia for the third in-person annual summit. There are, in fact, only 6 other groups that the US president holds an annual summit with, and this is but the latest addition to a list that includes NATO, the G7, the G20, APEC, the East Asia Summit, and the UN Climate Conference. However, President Biden has curtailed his visit to Australia, as has been reported, and the Quad will now be meeting most likely on the sidelines of the G7 in Hiroshima in Japan. The Quad, as many of you know, has had an interesting evolution. It began with coordinated responses among the 4 countries to the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. The 4 countries also met at a working level in 2007 and conducted their initial naval exercise involving Singapore. But since 2017, a decade later, the Quad has grown, meeting at the foreign ministers level, and in parallel, resurrecting quadrilateral maritime exercises. Since 2021, after Biden's election, the group has both elevated and broadened its activities. Starting with just 3 working groups, the Quad now includes over 20 working groups and initiatives, from educational fellowships and maritime domain awareness to supply chains and cybersecurity. To provide some perspectives from Australia, Japan, and India, let me first turn, because I know he's on, at least his sound is on, to Mark Watson, who is Director of ASPI, Washington, D.C. Within hours of becoming Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese last year went off to Japan for for his first Quad Summit last year. But this year, with Australia supposed to have been hosting it, how is the Quad now seen in Australia? Over to you, Mark.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. And apologies for the video. We're just having a few technical problems. Look, the Quad is a very, very significant part of Australia's current statecraft. And I use the word statecraft very advisedly. Australia recently released its Defence Security Review. And one of the key points in that review was to re-emphasize the importance of statecraft as a tool of national defense and national security. And by statecraft, it refers to a whole of government approach, the need to pull together all the tools of national power, not just the hard-edged military power, but also diplomacy, aid, disaster response, trade. And the Quad really fits the times in its emphasis on statecraft. Australia has always been very heavily reliant on international partnerships, alliances, and treaty agreements for its own sense of national security. It's no coincidence that Australia was a foundation member of the League of Nations, the United Nations, CETO, the 5 Power Defence Arrangements, and trade, of course, for a trading nation like Australia. International trade security is also critical, hence foundation members of the World Trade Organization, RCEP, CPTPP, APEC, you name it. And at the core of those concentric circles of larger arrangements lie the hardcore of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 5 being the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangements, 4 being the Quad, 3 being trilateral relationships, whether it's the Australia, US, Japan trilateral security dialogue or the ANZUS defense arrangements, and then the bilateral relationships within those. And the Quad fulfills a really critical role for Australia inside those concentric circles of security and trade arrangements, because it connects Australia, its historical European settlement past, and its Indo-Pacific future. It connects global North and global South. It provides a bridge, if you like, from Australia's traditional Anglosphere security arrangements and agreements with, as I say, its Indo-Pacific future. And that is really important. The next point I'd make is that it reinforces the point that Australia is both an Indian Ocean country and a Pacific Rim country. Australia sits at the hinge of the Indo-Pacific. The north-south axis runs from Australia to Japan and east-west up to, of course, northwest to India, northeast to the United States. And for the Indo-Pacific as a concept to have any meaning, it must engage India. There is no Indo-Pacific without India. And the Quad is one vehicle that connects India to this Indo-Pacific project, if you like. The final quick point I'll make, recognizing time, is I really don't accept the criticism that the Quad is somehow, a toothless tiger, because it is not expressly military in nature. It is the fact that it's able to bring together those elements of statecraft, if you like, of the softer power elements of security, and by that I mean national and international security, that is in fact its strength. I believe it enables India, for example, to engage with the grouping in a way with which it is comfortable, and allow it to develop at a pace with which India is comfortable. And as I say, without India, there is no Indo-Pacific. And so for me, the Quad represents a core piece of Australia's international trade statecraft, and I think it very much fits the times. Thank you.
Mark, if I can ask a quick follow-up, and thank you for the very succinct and nice overview. Is there a sense that the sort of enthusiasm for the Quad has remained? You've had a change in government in Australia over the past year. Has that enthusiasm for the Quad continued over that transition?
Drew, I'd say it's actually grown, if anything. I mean, don't get me wrong, both sides of politics in Australia are great supporters of the Quad, but the incoming Labor government, a centre-left government in Australia, definitely re-emphasised or restated Australia's commitment to not just, as I say, military alliances and partnerships, but being a good neighbour in the Pacific, paying more attention. I think Australia's attention was distracted by the wars in the Middle East, in Iraq and then in Afghanistan. And a large part of our international effort, both military and diplomatic and other, was directed towards that part of the world. It's now definitely flowed back to the Indo-Pacific and the Pacific in particular. And the current government really does emphasise the importance of issues like environmental issues and disaster response and diplomacy as a critical part of an integrated national security strategy. So I would say, if anything, that this, again, as I say, I think the Quad fits the times, both internationally, but in particular for the current government and for Australia's current defence strategic settings.
Thank you. Next, can I turn to Professor Kei Koga? He's now based in Singapore, but previously had affiliations with CSIS, Wilson Center, amongst other places, has a PhD from the Fletcher School. Koga-san, Japan has turned into, in some ways, a last-minute host of the Quad meeting. How does the Quad fit into Prime Minister Kishida's larger outreach, especially as it relates to economic security? Over to you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this the important and interesting panel on the Quad. And I also would like to thank the Japan Center for International Exchange USA, JCI USA, ORF America, and ASPI Washington, D.C. for organizing this panel. So before responding to your question, and also the Japan's kind of general view on the Quad, I just would like to kind of make a note about the it's unfortunate the incident that Quad Summit in Sydney was canceled at the last minute because of the U.S. domestic affairs. President Biden need to actually discuss with the Congress over the U.S. debt ceiling, and obviously, like this is not a good sign for the Quad. And some argue that this shows unreliability of the U.S. commitment to the region. And I tend to agree with this assessment, and it is particularly disappointing to see the cancellation of the Biden's visit to Papua New Guinea that may be illustrated the lack of commitment to the Pacific Islands. But this is not completely surprising either. In the past, the United States canceled the trip to the Asia like this. President Obama actually canceled the trip to Asia in 2013, which included his participation in APEC and the East Asia Summit. And President Trump didn't show up in the ASEAN-related forums for the almost 3 years from the 2018 to the 2020. So obviously, the United States should take this issue seriously and make every effort to participate in Asia-related forums because we always care about it. But at the same time, the Asia should prepare as this would happen in the future too. So to this end, maybe the Quad should be more kind of institutionalized. They are not like completely formalized, but like institutionalized so that the four-member corporation is not entirely dependent on their leaders. So that's just my kind of initial note for the cancellation. But for this panel, I'm asked to discuss Japan's perspective on the Quad. So let me quickly summarize the three main general points about Japan's view on the Quad from my own perspective. The first, Japan considers Quad's main objective is to maintain and strengthen the rules-based international order in the Pacific, the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific, FOIP. The four members share the fundamental values, so that Japan continuously believes that the members would likely cooperate with each other and signals their shared political positions in the world to the international community. And in this connection, Prime Minister Kishida stated in the last year, May 2022, that the framework is not targeting to the any particular state. So more like the international order than the any kind of like the targeting state. And of course, some argues that the countering China is the main the objective of the Quad implicitly. And I did not deny completely this, but the reason why like the Quad is important in this aspect is that the broader objective of the Quad is more kind of maintaining and strengthening the international order, and then the Japan sees that China is challenging the existing rules-based international order. So that's why like there's a certain kind of overlaps between what people said about the Quad countering China and also Quad maintaining the international order. And then secondly, Japan's role in the Quad has changed since Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's era. The Abe administration, both the first one in 2007 and the second one in 2012, has played a leading role in the creation and also recalibration of the Quad, which aimed to ensure U.S. commitment, empower Australia and India, and then constrain the assertive China in the Pacific region. And initially, this view was not necessarily supported by other members of the Quad because each of them had relatively stable relations with China, and China was not so influential in the region. But when the four members started to gradually agree with the necessity of recalibrating the Quad because of China's growing power and then also China's assertive behavior, then the United States and the others also take the initiative to institutionalize or to strengthen the Quad. And then Japan actually somewhat became the more kind of relatively active follower than the leader. And then this actually changed a little bit the dynamics of the Quad inside. And I think the Quad is because of that the commitments that the four countries made, the Quad has been institutionalized. Again, like I'm not saying like formalized in the sense that like they are trying to create the secretariat or they are concluding the legal treaties, but like, institutionalized in terms of the regularization of the high-level meeting and also the more kind of the working groups, like number of working groups they set up. So that actually makes sure that like each member meet with each other. And then the Japan is supporting for this kind of like initiatives too. And then third, the Japan considers that the Quad is an institutionalized but informal framework that focuses on the functional cooperation, not aiming to create the Asian NATO. There are three reasons for this. And one is that the member states do not always share the same strategic perspective on the Indo-Pacific region or threat perception towards China. And given this, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to make the Quad Asian NATO. And in fact, the former Prime Minister Suga rejected the idea explicitly in 2020, and then Kishida seems to agree with or take this kind of position. And another is that rather than making it a concrete security framework like the military alliance, Quad members look for what tangible the cooperation they can pursue together. And exploring this possibility is important to consolidate the four members' cooperation, and then so that the Quad has now like the many cooperative agendas, including the vaccine, global health, the infrastructure, maritime security, critical and emerging the technology, HADR, etc., etc. So and then lastly, the other one is that the Quad is now like trying to provide the regional public goods in order to gain regional support for maintaining the existing international order and then by doing so, I think the coalition building is really, really important, because then you could actually share the burden, and then you could actually aim to the common the goal. So I guess this is the thing that Japan aims at. But one thing I would like to kind of add is that the economic security is a really important issue for the Japan, and then the Japan is pursuing that. But I'm not really sure to what extent Japan actually emphasized this aspect in the Quad. I mean, the Quad is important, and then always whenever Kishida goes, I think he emphasized the importance of the economic security. But then I think the Kishida, when like he was emphasizing the economic security, it gets the more kind of bilateral setting, and also it gets more like the global setting, like the G7 or the United, the other bigger kind of the frameworks or the international cooperative the institutions. So I guess that's the economic security is somewhat differentiated from the Quad agenda. But then I think at the end of the day, the Quad has been evolving. So maybe like they could actually incorporate this kind of agenda to push forward this agenda. And then I think because of the time I stop here, but I talk more about critical and then the technological kind of cooperation among the Quad, and also the institutional the relationship between Quad and then the ASEAN and the other the regional frameworks in the other Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I can ask a quick follow-up, you mentioned that the Quad is not has been I like to reframe it institutionalized but not formalized in some ways. That there are a lot of institutional links now amongst the Quad countries, but you don't have a secretariat or legal treaties. There seem to be two schools of thought on that. Some people believe that is necessary, particularly for the Quad to be effective and for its longevity. And others who believe that actually the strength of the Quad is in having a more flexible architecture. Where do you come out in your opinion? Do you think it should be there should be a secretariat or a legal structure or not?
I think if we think about the internal kind of like the relationship, like the intra-member the relationship, including the India, the Australia, I think the flexibility is more important, because again, like as I said, the strategic perspective among the four countries are not necessarily the same, and then sometimes the timing may be not right to talk about particular things, so that I think that means the flexibility helps. But at the same time, if we think about the Quad and with the external relations, like with the external the institution like ASEAN or the other regional organizations, maybe to some extent the formalization may help, because if you formalize it, then like it's actually better or good tool to depoliticize the particular agenda. If you are actually if you don't formalize it, maybe like political actor makes a certain particular political statement, and that creates the tensions with the other countries or like the other regional organizations. So in that sense, I think like there's it cuts both ways. But at the end of the day, like the most important thing at first is to get the consensus or agreements within the Quad members. So I believe that after we come to agree with the institutionalization or formalization, then we could proceed.
Thank you so much. Now, if I may turn finally, last but not least, to my ORF colleague in India, Dr. Raji Rajgopalan, who is Director of the Center for Security, Strategy and Technology at ORF. Also has affiliated with the Perth US Asia Center and has written very prolifically about various Quad-related issues, including the technological aspect. Raji, what do you see as India's priorities, including on technology cooperation as it relates to the Quad? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dhruva. And it's great to be part of this conversation. Of course, I think there is some disappointment about the cancellation of the Quad meeting in Australia as planned. But I think they will make sure to meet on the sidelines of the G7 meeting in here, Japan for sure. So it's still going through. We will go through a meeting, but I think there is some disappointment even beyond the Quad countries. So that the Quad countries will understand the US domestic compulsions. But I think, again, others in the region are also looking at it and raising questions about the US reliability. So that's a question that will keep coming back in some sense, about the US in a sense. Nevertheless, getting on to what is important for India in being a part of the Quad, I think India is quite concerned about the threat from China. And I think that's very, very clear. By extension, India sees the Quad primarily limited to China and not as a broader coalition of states with like-minded partners. And I think it's important to understand this because there is some discomfort within the Quad, not aired as much, but I think as well as among the India's new security partners about the position, for instance, that India takes on issues like Russian invasion of the Ukraine conflict and similar such kind of contentious issues. India has had a slightly different take than the other Quad members. So that relates to how India looks at the Quad, primarily related to China. So from an Indian perspective, Quad is not about Russia or the Middle East or even about the liberal international order. India might make a lot of noise about the liberal international order, but I think there is a distinction in the Indian articulation of the liberal international order as compared to other Quad partners. Second, India's participation in the Quad and the intensity of the Quad or the depth of its participation all have kept pace with and correlated with the threats that India faces from China. So India's outlook towards the Quad changed dramatically when it became clear that China's aggressiveness towards India had not changed. So after the Galwan conflict in 2020, India again began for the first time calling the Quad by its name instead of calling it by the cumbersome US, India, Japan, Australia grouping. It has also become much more open to intensifying the Quad interactions and activities. The military chiefs of the Quad countries just met a few days ago. Australia will be hosting the Malabar exercise. Again, you can call it a Quad exercise, Malabar, irrespective of the name. The 4 Quad countries are doing military exercises together. But the way India looks at the Quad, it's primarily seen as a means to send political deterrent signal to China that India has partners that it can count on if Beijing does not take into consideration India's concerns. Thus, the Quad is in a sense a means for New Delhi to enhance its diplomatic and political clout in dealing with China. But I think the political deterrent has also a threat component. It's also a signal to China that if it engages in aggressive behavior towards India, India can get closer to the Quad and become a more active member of the US security arrangements in the Indo-Pacific, Quad, and any number of unilaterals that have come up in the region. In addition to political signaling, I think the Quad is also a means for India to enhance its military capabilities. But this remains limited at the moment because India appears confident that it can hold China at the border. This is, again, helped by the fact that India appears to have a largely defensive orientation. It is almost certainly unlikely that India will take initiative to an offensive war against China, even in a preemptive manner. So, of course, defensive operations are far easier and less cumbersome, both tactically and strategically. And I think this is, again, evident from the fact that, like I said, before Galwan, India did not even call Quad by its name when the foreign ministers or the senior officials met. So the intensity of the threats has a direct bearing on the level and depth of India's participation in the Quad. But there is, like I said, even though I said there is some military potential, I think India still has some hesitancy about the military stuff. That therefore the non-security focus, the tech focus, the vaccine diplomacy, whole range of things, I think it comes from essentially India's perspective. In fact, Mark very rightly mentioned, it is about India's comfort level in how fast we want to go, how much we want to do in terms of security and military issues. Japan and Australia are already the US alliance partners, and there are many security arrangements that can focus on security and military stuff. In fact, even the bilateral Japan-Australia defense agreement is very significant in terms of what Japan and Australia can do together between their militaries and security departments, in a sense. And I think all of this comes from the fact that India appears reasonably confident about dealing with its northern borders. But even on that front, I think India seeks some assistance in terms of intelligence technologies, particularly surveillance technology and so on and so forth. Then, of course, the maritime front, I think Indian Ocean region gets greater recognition in terms of its collaboration, greater collaboration that is required through the Quad. Many who have been part of the Indian establishment has talked about this very openly to say that how India needs a Quad to deal with maritime security issues, especially as it pertains to the Indian Ocean region. But India is also supportive of other efforts that may not be purely Quad, the AUKUS, for instance. India has been fully supportive of the AUKUS, the benefits of having a more capable Australia, a more capable maritime naval Australia is in India's interest, as well as in the broader interest of the Indo-Pacific region. And I think the Indian support came through, was most evident when the AUKUS discussion happened at the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, where China even put up a resolution criticizing the AUKUS as failing the non-proliferation goals and how it's a loophole in the NPT and so on and so forth, to which India went out of its way in gathering support for the AUKUS. But I think it's also possibly a sort of a return of favor, so to say, or reciprocity to Australia and the US, who have been supporting India on terrorism, counterterrorism issues, the border issues, and so on and so forth. Strangely, Russia got on board along with China, surprise, surprise, to criticize the AUKUS, saying that this is a violation of the NPT. But I will say that there is short memory there, because Russia did not find it any problematic, or it was no violation when Russia was supplying India with nuclear submarines, in a sense. So that's a strange sort of a beast out there. But the fact is that I think India does see AUKUS and such a kind of a mechanism as important to augment the overall military muscle of the other maritime powers in the region. So I think overall, I think India does look up to the Quad politically. Militarily, there are options, but I think India is still shows some hesitancy. But there are some problems, of course. Russia will continue to be an issue of difference, at least for some more time. India's Russia policy, I would say it will change because of the serious divergences as far as their security interests are concerned. The policy will change because of the China factor, but it may not change in the immediate future when, especially India would not want to be seen as changing its policy on Russia or any other foreign policy issues because of pressure from certain quarters and kind of things. So that's going to be a part of an issue that might crop up, but I think otherwise India is fully on board with the Quad because of the primarily driven by the China threat, and that doesn't seem to be disappearing anytime soon. Let me stop here, and I'll be happy to hear your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. We're already starting to get a few questions, and I'll try and group them together for each participant. So maybe start with Mark. Raji said that there's clearly sort of in some ways a response to China and Chinese assertiveness that is often galvanized or driven forward the agenda of the Quad. Would you say, I mean, this is getting to a question asked by one participant, Is it right to think of the Quad after 2020 as a version 2.0, and that the changes that have occurred have been because of the China factor? Mark, you've spent a lot of time in China. How would you assess that?
In a single word, yes. The simple fact is, without China's actions in recent years, I don't think you would have seen a revived Quad in the form that it is today. Partly, of course, from India's perspective, it's a very direct issue. It's a border issue, but also it's a regional, sphere of influence issue around in the immediate east of India, in Southeast Asia, Myanmar, etc., and of course in Sri Lanka. Actions that China has taken have prompted the four countries to recognise a commonality of cause that I don't think would have been there previously. And I absolutely agree with Raji about Russia and China, the relative importance of Russia and China to this. The reason that I have no problem, and I think people who consider this with some nuance have no problem with India's stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict being somewhat different from the other three members, is that Russia is not the main game for the Quad. China is the main game for the Quad. And the fact that we don't have a strict structure, a binding structure, means that there is space for people within the Quad to have variation without pulling the Quad apart. I think it's one of its strengths. And so I think we need to recognise that behind the resurrected Quad is the looming shadow of China.
Thank you. Two questions for Professor Koga. One from me a bit, just to get at something that Raji said. On the one hand, the Quad takes pains to say that it's not a security grouping, and you emphasize that is the emphasis has been on sort of non-security matters, and yet at the same time, you've seen the resurrection of the Malabar exercises that involve all four Quad countries. Again, what started off as a US-India bilateral naval exercise, Japan, and then Australia was added to. We had the four military chiefs meeting just last week, I believe, in California, of the four countries. We've had intelligence chiefs meeting reportedly. There's a cybersecurity dialogue. There are a lot of security adjacent issues, maritime domain awareness, that the Quad is actively working on. So on the one hand, again, rhetorically, you see, not a lot, this is not a military, and yet a lot of the activity does seem to be, again, if not overtly military, although some of it is, so military adjacent. How do you think Japan views what's the level of enthusiasm for the security component of the cooperation?
Thank you very much. I think Japan is also up for the security cooperation, but maybe not through the Quad, because I think Japan can work on those kind of security issues with India, United States, and also Australia trilaterally and bilaterally. So, and also, as you mentioned, and as everybody mentioned, Malabar is the kind of one military exercises that the four member states of Quad actually participating. So I guess the important thing that the Japan may be actually thinking about is those kind of the separation between those military and then quasi-military or non-traditional security kind of framework that the Quad can actually push forward. By doing so, I think the Quad could actually open the segue to cooperate with the other non-kind of member states outside. That is probably the countries in the global south and so. Because many the countries in for example, Southeast Asia were concerned about the increased intensification of the U.S.-China strategic rivalry, and then also the instability in the regional security, and then also the balance of power, increasingly the dynamic kind of balance of power, the adjustment. So that is there's a risk involved in for the kind of future conflict that probably Southeast Asian countries or other regional countries don't want to see. And then the one way to actually alleviate this kind of tension is to kind of facilitate cooperation. And then the Quad, the agenda actually mostly overlapping with the agendas that those kind of global South countries actually push forward. And then I think like the infrastructure and also the global health, the education, these are really important things for the global South too. And then that is a kind of like the segue for them to actually cooperate with them. If the Quad include the military components in it, maybe like that would actually create some tensions, and then they may not actually want to actually cooperate with the Quad, even if they want to. So I think in that way, the Quad for now, the Quad can be actually separated from the military component, while the other member states can work with the bilateral, trilateral, or like other actual framework militarily.
And so another question for you from Kazuyo Kato. Question for Dr. Keikoga. What is the current relationship between ASEAN and the Quad? And where are areas where the two frameworks align or not align regarding the future of the region?
Yeah, this is the good question because the ASEAN had been concerned about the existence of Quad because the Quad was generally seen as the countering the China, and then the ASEAN doesn't want to support it because that means like ASEAN is actually supporting for the framework that countering China. The ASEAN was taking the kind of step back, and then they see how it evolves. And then when like they saw the Quad evolving into the more kind of non-military component and providing the regional public goods to the region, they could actually support it. So now like I think the ASEAN member states and then also ASEAN were more inclined to actually cooperate with the Quad. I don't know if it's going to be the institutionally or if it's going to be the kind of individual countries based. But I think they are more I'm seeing more supportive. Kind of like I think like they are more supportive to the Quad. And again, like as I said, those kind of areas such as the global health and the infrastructure, and also HADR, maritime domain awareness. These are the issues that the Southeast Asian countries were also they're willing to cooperate and they're willing to strengthen their capability to manage those issues. So in that sense, I think like there are certain kind of ways they could actually cooperate with each other.
Thank you. A couple of questions to Raji, particularly on the technological angle. So one question, is there a semiconductor working group within the Quad, and are the recent ISET and MOUs related, it's the US-India bilateral, related to semiconductor cooperation? Do they have a Quad angle or strategy as well? And also on that front, if you do the different strategic perspectives of the Quad countries affect the working group on non-military topics, such as on climate and space? So if you could address the semiconductor and space parts particularly, that would be helpful.
Okay, great. Thanks for that question. I think the Quad is beginning to focus a great deal on the technology aspects, because I think that's one area where China has been using the technology to grow its influence and penetrate into different societies and kind of thing, whether it is in the Indo-Pacific or even to other regions and so on and so forth. So Quad has begun to focus a lot more on the critical and emerging technologies, which also includes the semiconductor issues, not spelled out in as many words, but I think that's part of the issues in a sense that we are looking at. When you look at the critical and emerging technology working group on that's under the Quad, but other technology related ones include, of course, the space and cyber, and critical emerging technologies. These are three working groups that looks at a whole range of the tech related issues in a sense, which also goes to include the supply chain, and the semiconductor is increasingly part of that. Even the India-US ISET, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, that is right now it is a bilateral sort of an agreement or a bilateral initiative. But I think that's something that it will find a great amount of resonance within groupings like the Quad, because I think the Quad countries, each of them bring their own strength, and there is a certain amount of expertise and technological sophistication that they can each bring to the bring to bear. So I think this is again something that we will find even within the Quad. I think that's something that will continue to kind of evolve. It is still a work in progress, but I think that's something that you will find a great amount of sort of a synergy among the four countries to do something together with regard to all the various critical technologies. Cyber has emerged as one of the most, both India and US in particular. India and US in particular are the most cyber vulnerable countries with the most number of cyber attacks, especially over the last few years. If you look at the fintech and the health sector and kind of thing, how they have been affected. So building the cyber resilience is part of the game in a sense. That's one set of issues that the two countries will look at, but also within the broader cyber Quad context in a sense. Second, even in terms of, I think some of the other issues when looked at the critical and emerging technology includes the 5G and even the work on 6G. Joint facilitation of these are happening already in a sense. Some of the other technologies include biotechnology, which has not been really talked about in as much in the current Quad context or even in the bilateral context. But I think that's also something that's beginning to have a lot more bearing on what we do together. Artificial intelligence, semiconductor supply chains, these are again things that will that will work, that's being being considered, being part of the working groups at this point of time. But I think that's still a work in progress. But at this point of time, we haven't seen too many things happen, but I think that is a matter of time before we evolve into kind of a clear policy articulation in terms of what we want to do, how we sort of collaborate on this particular area of technology.
I think one other area, and you obviously know more about this than me. I think one of the areas that the Quad Working Group on Critical and Emerging Technologies was quite seized of was open ORAN I believe that seems to have translated a little bit into the bilateral ISET discussions between the US and India on the rollout of India's 5G telecom. But so that's one. I mean, it might be one example of the Quad actually influencing a bilateral agenda. But
right, exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
There's a question on South Korea, and I thought maybe Dr. Koga could address that a little bit. That is what is the prospect of including South Korea in Quad-related groupings? I understand, previously there were differences between Japan and South Korea that inhibited some of that cooperation, but yet under the Yoon presidency, we seem to have seen quite a big change in Japan-Korea and even US-Korea relations. What do you see at the prospects of closer Quad cooperation with South Korea?
I think Japan is going to be pretty supportive if the South Korea wants to come in. But again, this depends on how the other member states actually consider about the Quad as it is. And what I actually heard about this kind of Quad the institutionalization the matter is that within the Quad there are already many agendas, and then also many bureaucracies the ministers actually got involved, and then they are actually trying to coordinate, but it's not actually coordinate in a way that they want to be more kind of effective. So in that, I think by adding another member formally to the Quad is going to be kind of making certain complication and the difficulties. So even if South Korea is going to get involved to some extent to the Quad activities, it's going to be more kind of informal, and it could be probably more how do I say, the working group based. So if the South Korea wants to get into the cooperation in the critical and then the emerging technologies, then maybe that's the kind of working in technologies. The working groups that the South Korea could participate as at first observer also. And then I think for that and to that extent, Japan is going to be pretty supportive. And then also Japan is pretty happy with the current status with the South Korea. Obviously, the President Yoon is very, very friendly with Japan, and then he is more willing to negotiate with what has been obstacle between the two countries in the past. And then, that's a great sign. But then one thing like we have to be careful about it in the future, maybe like if the change in the presidency in South Korea may create a different kind of like the relationship too. So in that sense, probably like we need to be to what extent we could actually have the kind of institutionalized cooperation bilaterally, and then also the multilaterally. I guess my kind of one more thing, like I guess like my thinking is that the institutionalizing South Korea or like incorporating South Korea into the larger multilateral framework, focusing on the in the Pacific would be probably like the better, because then it's not going to be the more kind of intense relationship between Japan and the South Korea, and then they could actually cooperate with the other countries for the Indo-Pacific as well. Like it's more like an ASEAN +3 framework and so on and so forth. So if we could create, I mean, IPF is already there, and then the South Korea is there. So, but like if we have like the other institutions, maybe like the Japan should encourage the South Korea to get into those kind of Indo-Pacific frameworks.
Raji, you had your hand up. You want to jump in on that?
Yeah, just also relating to some of the other questions, like the Quad can be expected to sort of expand and more countries join up. I think whether you want to call the Quad expand, because Quad is essentially a four-member grouping. It's a numerical thing, so it's going to be Quad. But you can think about a Quad Plus, and we did have a Quad Plus in the COVID pandemic context, where you brought in the countries like New Zealand, Vietnam, and South Korea were part of that grouping. So it kind of gone away sort of in the post-pandemic context in some sense. But I think there is a possibility of expanding the Quad to include other similar like-minded countries in a sense, who all share very similar threat perceptions as far as China is concerned, who all of them have, for instance, even in these three countries, have gone through China's aggressive behavior in their own backyard, in their neighborhood, in a sense. So there is a possibility of expanding the Quad, whether it is you want to call it a Quad Plus or you want to call it by some other name, we can decide on that. But I think the expansion or some other minilateral that might emerge, I think those are very possible, very likely outcomes in the coming years.
I just want to address a question to Mark. There's a few questions. You'd mentioned trade being a big focus and trade priorities being a big focus for Australia. Given that Australia, this is a response to a question, given Australia is the only one of the Quad countries that has a major trade surplus with China, and given that also that there's been a shift in some ways, we mentioned IPEF, but also a shift to a lot of supply chain security issues, where do you see the Quad playing a role in trade negotiations going forward?
Look, I don't see the Quad as having a direct role in trade. It's not a trade agreement, but it does have an indirect impact on trade policy and on something that was mentioned earlier around economic security. As you know, Australia has been on the wrong end of non-tariff trade barriers imposed by China on our coal, beef, seafood, wine, a whole range of products. And that generated two things in Australia. It forced Australia to diversify away from China. So the trade with our next four largest trading partners, I think, nearly doubled. And that was coupled with the fact that China had to take our iron ore. It needed it too much. And the price of our iron ore has gone up. Our volumes of export have gone up. And the combination of those two factors means that the impact that China may have hoped to have with its trade sanctions simply haven't eventuated. And the gap has been filled. And one of the lasting structural changes will be this diversification, because the emphasis, as it had been for so long, so heavily on export across a range of products to China has changed, with that people now recognize the inherent risk in that. So the Quad itself is not a trade grouping, but it is a grouping built on principles around a free and open Indo-Pacific, and that includes trade agreements and recognizing there are certain rules of the road in the way we deal with each other in international trade and economics. And so I do think that it will have an impact on how China sees international responses, because one of the things on the economic security front that the trade sanctions have done is it's made Australia and others say, well, how can we cooperate in future if it's somebody else who's on the wrong end of these sanctions? And we know that many other countries, apart from Australia, of course, at different times have been subject to the same economic coercion. So that's creating a sense of, well, should we be able to cooperate in some way to not, if you like, cut each other's throat when these sanctions are imposed? Because trade historically is the one area where even the closest of security partners will compete with each other in quite, I won't say vicious, but highly competitive ways. And plenty of countries were happy to fill the gap when Australia was cut out of the China trade. So there's now this issue that is created, and maybe the Quad is a forum for this kind of discussion around economic security and how we respond in the face of Chinese economic coercion in the future.
So final question, we're running out of time, so I'll go to all three, maybe start with Raji and then Koga-san and then Mark in that order. This is a response to one question, and it's one a lot of us hear quite often. How big is the gap, or is there a gap between the hype and the reality surrounding the Quad? Is there expectations too high, or is the Quad, on the other hand, is there some people say, is the Quad doing a lot and are people less aware of it? So maybe start with Raji.
Yeah, sure. No, I think Quad is, I think we managed to create the right amount of reaction. China is getting noticed but at the same time, China, what did it say? It's not a paper tiger, sea fog. So it used various kind of terms to describe that Quad is a meaningless thing. It is just a kind of a forum that is not going to make any meaningful impact in terms of the Indo-Pacific geopolitics or technology or other important strategic issues and so on and so forth. But the fact that we have come a long way, and that is the first time the Quad came together. Maybe we thought it was not going to, and it kind of withered away. But the fact that you had a Quad coming back for a second avatar in 2017, 10 years later, shows that there is the intensity of the threats that brought together the four countries the first time have only intensified that much more, have become that much more serious for all the four countries. And that really brought back the focus. And this was pre-Galwan in a sense for India. And even for India to take seriously the Quad and the manner in which we have kind of intensified our participation, the depth of discussions that we have, the range of subjects that we deal with, even in the technology domain. That was something, even for, just to give you an example, on the space front, for instance, India traditionally partnered with the G21 countries, that is mostly the non-alignment group countries, in the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva, the forum where space security issues are discussed and arms control issues are discussed. We partnered with the G21 countries, insisting on a legally binding mechanism. From there, in the Quad joint statement, we actually said we, with the Quad countries, will consult on norms of responsible behavior, rules, regulations. That's a huge departure we have seen in the case of even for India. And of course, the other technologies also being taken, all with the focus on ensuring that the technologies are developed there is a respect for freedom of expression, privacy, promoting technology development and usage in line with shared values, autonomy, agency, dignity of individuals, and kind of things. So whether it's on tech issues or other strategic issues, or the military focus has been slightly the sort of a less focus. But if you look at the March, this year, the foreign ministers, the Quad foreign ministers meeting in their public sort of a discussion at the Raisina dialogue, they clearly, especially the Indian minister coming and talking about maritime security and counterterrorism as two major aspects of the Quad cooperation. I think that was a big takeaway, even though the Japanese minister came out and said Quad is not a security grouping. It doesn't matter to me because it's usually India that takes the sort of backseat in terms of saying that, Quad is a security grouping. So the fact that India came out and actually talked about maritime security and counterterrorism, to me, that is most significant. So the security aspect of the Quad is also going to gain greater traction in the coming years. And I think China has helped us a great deal in bringing us all together. And I think we are here to stay for a while. Thank you.
Thank you. Koga-san?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think for the expectation, I think it's getting better. Probably like in the past, like it's more like the high expectation that like the quad cannot actually meet. And the reason is because in the past peak there was like only 1 million lateral that could actually be the strategically relevant. That was quad. So like if you look at the 4 countries, then the capabilities in terms of the military and economics, like those are major countries in the Pacific, and then they could actually do something. Like there's a certain kind of expectations from the public and then also the policymakers. If they cooperate right, then there could be something. So they actually they expected the military cooperation, economic cooperation, and everything. But then now, like if you take a look at today's in the Pacific landscape, there are more kind of institutionalized framework, IPEF, AUKUS, and also there are more kind of stronger bilateral cooperation between the Japan, Australia, trilateral cooperation, the US, Japan, Australia, and also like the bilateral cooperation, Japan or India actually is getting stronger too. So in that sense, like we don't have to put everything in the Quad anymore. And that makes actually created the more kind of leeway for Quad to play the appropriate role in the Pacific. That is probably like India could be the pacemaker, and but so we could actually just kind of follow the India, and India is again like Mark-san and Raj said is important in the Pacific. Without India, there's not gonna be there in the Pacific. So in that case, in that sense, the Quad is a very, very important framework. But then at the same time, like we can't actually expect everything from the Quad. And then like now, like we have more kind of the tools to actually deal with other issues in the Pacific. So I guess the expectation is getting right, probably like compared with in the past. So that's kind of my response to your question.
And finally, Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Dhruva. Look, I agree absolutely with my 2 colleagues here. The Quad can only develop at the pace at which it can develop. There are very different countries involved here, and we need to recognize it can't be all things to all people. But to me, and I apologize in advance to our non-cricket following listeners, but it's like criticizing Virat Kohli because he's not a very good leg spinner. That's not his job. That's not his role. He has a role that is successful, highly successful. And I think the Quad, it wasn't that long ago, there was no functioning Quad at all. And look where it is today. But it will only develop at the pace at which, on different issues, if you like, the slowest member of the group can accept whatever it is that we're looking towards. But I really think it's unfair to criticize the Quad because it hasn't developed in a particular path. It will grow organically. I think it has come an enormously long way, and I think it can still grow further.
Yeah, thank you. No, it does seem striking also if you just look at the constituent bilateral relationships and how much what the sort of tangible outcomes that have come to have imagined a few years ago that Japan and Australia would have a reciprocal access agreement that allows troops to be stationed on each other's soil, for India and Australia to have a trade agreement amongst each other, AUKUS, the sharing of nuclear technology between the US and Australia, the Japan-US semiconductor cooperation agreement. So, in some ways, it seems like they're very tangible things to show in a lot of the constituent bilateral relationship that the touch points of the Quad have helped enable and are reflecting. And then, as I think Raji or somebody had mentioned as well, a lot of groupings beyond that involve all 4 Quad countries plus others, whether on coordinating COVID responses or supply chains under IPEF, or on artificial intelligence or other areas where those 4 countries are all together along with other relevant stakeholders. So with that, I think it's been an hour. Thank you all for joining us and for taking the time. And we'll see what happens when the Quad leaders meet very shortly in Japan. Thanks again. And thank you again on behalf of ORF America and our partner. We're very privileged to be working with JCIE USA and ASPE Washington, DC. Thanks again.